December 8th, 1941, Chicago, Illinois. The radio crackled through the cold air. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Across America, people froze in shock, but in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, one man sat silently by the window. Joe Louis Barrow, the heavyweight champion of the world. The man who had once knocked out Hitler's favorite fighter, Max Schmeling, now stared at a flag fluttering in the wind and made a decision that would change his life. The next morning, he walked into a military recruitment office. The clerk looked up, stunned. "Mr. Lewis, what can we do for you?" Joe simply answered, "I'm here to join." He didn't need the money, the glory, or the headlines. He already had those. But Joe Louis had always believed strength meant nothing if it wasn't used to protect others. Within days, newspapers screamed, "Champion joins the fight." His enlistment electrified America, especially black Americans who saw for the first time one of their own become a national hero on equal ground. When Joe arrived at Fort Riley, Kansas, there was no red carpet. There was segregation. White soldiers ate in one mess, black soldiers in another. Some officers refused to salute him. Joe said nothing. He trained in the dust like any man, up before dawn, drilling, cleaning rifles he would never fire. He slept in rough barracks on a thin cot, laughing with recruits who couldn't believe the world champion tied his own boots. "Ain't no champion here," he'd say. "We all soldiers now." The army saw an opportunity. A famous black boxer could boost morale, show unity. So they sent Joe Louis across America. Speeches, camps, parades, endless photographs. But Joe wasn't a puppet. At one base, he saw black troops forced to stand behind the white audience. He refused to step in the ring. "Either we fight together or we don't fight at all," he said. The officers hesitated, but the crowd erupted. That night, for the first time, white and black soldiers watched shoulder to shoulder. It was more than a boxing match. It was the beginning of a quiet revolution. Money poured in from exhibition fights, thousands of dollars, and Joe gave it all away. To the Army Relief Fund, to families of fallen soldiers, to military hospitals. "A lot of things are wrong with America," he told reporters, "but Hitler ain't gonna fix them." The quote spread everywhere, from barracks to newspapers to Roosevelt's desk. His generosity made him a legend among troops. They called him the people's champion in uniform. But the government that praised him also kept records. Every donation, every unpaid tax, it was all written down, waiting for later. By early 1942, Joe Louis had become more than an athlete. He was the living symbol of what America wanted to believe about itself. Strong, united, righteous. Yet behind the headlines, he saw the cracks. Black soldiers still barred from combat, still insulted in trains and towns. One night a fellow soldier asked him, "Why fight for a country that don't fight for us?" Joe stared into the darkness and said softly, "Because maybe it will someday." That year his days blurred together. Training, traveling, smiling for photos, hiding exhaustion. In one base, he boxed in front of 5,000 soldiers under blinding floodlights. The crowd roared with each punch. But Joe wasn't fighting an opponent that night. He was fighting despair. Every blow was a reminder to the men watching that courage could still exist, that faith still mattered. When the fight ended, he lifted the microphone and said, "We're gonna win because we're on God's side." The men erupted. For weeks, that phrase echoed through tents and trenches, scribbled on helmets, carved into mess tables. It wasn't just a line, it was a prayer. In a war where death came without warning, Joe Louis had given them something to believe in. He continued his tours through 1942, visiting hospitals filled with wounded boys from North Africa. He shook their hands, smiled, joked, called them champs. One medic wrote home, "When Joe Louis walked in, the whole ward forgot their pain. Even the ones who couldn't stand tried to sit up." But behind that calm face, Joe was tired. The days on trains, the nights on cots, the endless pressure to be perfect. It was a different kind of battle. He missed the ring, the structure, the silence before a fight. Now his fight was chaos, racism, politics, exhaustion, yet he never complained. In letters home he wrote only, "I'm doing what I can." By the end of 1942, he had become the Army's most famous soldier and one of its most loyal. But the irony wasn't lost on him. He could lift a nation's spirit, yet he couldn't eat beside half of it. He could fight for freedom abroad, yet still be denied full dignity at home. Still he pressed forward, because giving up was something Joe Louis Barrow had never learned to do. As winter turned to spring, he prepared to leave for the next stage of his service, North Africa, where real war waited. Before boarding the transport, he looked back at the training camp, the barracks, the segregated mess hall. He didn't say much, just a quiet nod to a private beside him. "Let's go earn it." The engine started. The ship pulled away from the dock, and somewhere in the dark Atlantic, the heavyweight champion of the world stood on deck, wind cutting through his coat, staring at the horizon. He wasn't going to fight for belts or titles anymore. He was going to fight for something bigger, faith, unity, and the belief that even a divided country could still stand on God's side. North Africa, 1943. The air was dry and heavy with dust. The sound of engines and faraway gunfire rolled across the desert like thunder. When Joe Louis stepped off the truck, the soldiers around him froze for a moment, not because he was a celebrity, but because they couldn't believe he was actually there. The world heavyweight champion had come to the front lines, not as an entertainer or a symbol, but as one of them. For months, American troops had been fighting across North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, sleeping in the sand, eating rations, losing friends every day. The desert burned by day and froze by night. Men stopped believing the war would ever end. But that morning, a rumor spread through the camp. Joe Louis is here. When he walked through the tents, helmets turned, men whispered, and a strange energy swept the camp. The officers gathered them all for an improvised show, a boxing ring made from rope and barrels, in the middle of the sand. Soldiers climbed on tanks and jeeps to watch. Joe Louis laced up his gloves, his uniform sleeves rolled up, sweat already glistening on his skin. Across from him stood another soldier, skinny, pale, smiling nervously. Joe gave him a wink. There were no bright lights, no referees, no journalists, just men who hadn't smiled in months. Joe boxed gently, controlled, making the fight look real but never cruel. Each punch lifted the crowd higher, each dodge drew laughter. And when it ended, he raised the other soldier's hand, declaring him the winner. The camp erupted. For a few minutes, war disappeared. Later, Joe took the microphone and said what would become his most famous line, "We're gonna win because we're on God's side." The soldiers cheered, but for many the words hit deeper than they expected. It wasn't about faith in heaven. It was faith in each other, faith that they still mattered, that America hadn't forgotten them. Those words spread faster than gunfire. They were repeated in letters, scratched into helmets, whispered in foxholes. Even generals quoted them in speeches. Joe spent the next months traveling between camps, ports, and hospitals. His schedule was brutal. Up before dawn, riding in open trucks under enemy skies, performing in towns that had just been bombed. Sometimes the roar of a plane would send the audience diving for cover. He'd wait until the silence returned, then smile and say, "You boys done? Let's finish the round." He wasn't fighting for medals. He was fighting for morale. To every man he met, he gave something the war had taken, a reason to hold on. He signed gloves, shook hands, told stories. He called every soldier champ. And when he left a base, men said the same thing. He made us feel human again. But Joe's mission wasn't just in the camps. He spent weeks visiting hospitals, wards filled with men burned, blinded, or missing limbs. He walked quietly between the beds, shaking hands, making jokes, pretending not to notice the pain. One nurse recalled, "When he came in, the room changed. The men sat up straighter. They didn't want him to see them broken." At night, when the camps went dark and the desert wind blew cold, Joe sat alone outside his tent, listening to the distant bombs. He had seen enough faces to know the truth. War didn't care about fame or glory. It only cared about who kept standing. He thought of the young soldiers who told him they'd watched his fight against Schmeling back in '38, how that knockout had given them pride before they even wore a uniform. Now he understood. That pride was his real weapon. Still, not everyone in uniform liked him. Some white officers called him just a showpiece. They said he didn't belong near the front. But even they couldn't deny what he did for morale. One colonel wrote privately, "Where Joe Louis goes, morale follows." In March 1943, he performed his 100th exhibition fight. The audience was mixed, white and black troops together. That hadn't happened before. It was Joe's quiet rebellion. He made it a rule: no segregation at his shows. "If I'm going to fight for freedom," he told a general, "I ain't doing it in front of a divided crowd." The general didn't like it, but he didn't stop him either. Joe had become untouchable, not because of politics, but because he had the hearts of the men. Sometimes, between fights, he'd get letters from home. His mother wrote prayers for him. Friends told him he was on every newspaper front page. But Joe barely had time to read. He moved constantly, from Africa to Sicily, then to England, then back to the States for another morale tour. His body grew thin, his eyes tired. Still, he never refused a visit, never missed a handshake. In one camp in Sicily, he met a group of black engineers building an airstrip. They were exhausted, filthy, ignored by most officers. Joe took off his jacket, grabbed a shovel, and started digging beside them. The men stared in disbelief. The champion of the world, working with them in the mud. When one of them said, "You don't have to do that, champ," Joe replied, "Neither do you, but we do it anyway, don't we?" Moments like that never made the papers, but they stayed in the hearts of the men who saw them. By late 1943, Joe Louis had become more than a symbol of strength. He was a symbol of equality. He proved that leadership didn't come from rank or skin color, but from the willingness to stand beside others in pain. The army tried to keep his image polished, but his real work happened far from the cameras, in the mud, the smoke, the laughter that followed fear. Before leaving North Africa, a reporter asked him what kept him going through the exhaustion, the travel, the death all around him. Joe looked out over the dunes and said quietly, "Every man out here is fighting his own war. I just remind them they ain't fighting alone." As 1943 ended, the US Army prepared for the next phase, Italy, then France, then Germany itself. The soldiers Joe had met would soon land on beaches, march through ruins, and face death again. But they would carry something with them, not a medal, not a flag, but a voice that still echoed through the night. "We're gonna win because we're on God's side." Italy, winter 1943. Rain turned the battlefields into rivers of mud. Soldiers moved like ghosts through the haze, their rifles rusted, their uniforms soaked. In those days, morale was a fragile thing. Hope came and went like smoke. And that's when Joe Louis arrived again, stepping out of a jeep with his gloves slung over his shoulder, looking more like a soldier than a star. The men stared. Some had seen him before in North Africa, others only knew his legend, the champion who fought for them, the man who told the world that God was on their side. He wasn't here to entertain generals. He was here for the ones sleeping in mud, the ones who hadn't heard laughter in months. In a half-destroyed hangar outside Naples, the army set up a makeshift ring. The ropes were frayed, the ground uneven, the lights flickering from a single generator. But when Joe stepped inside, it didn't matter. Thousands of soldiers packed in, boots stomping, helmets clanging, the air thick with cigarette smoke. "Hit 'em, champ," someone yelled. Joe smiled. "Not tonight," he said softly. He sparred with young recruits, soldiers with trembling hands and tired faces. He moved light, fast, graceful, just enough to remind them what strength looked like. Each cheer was a breath of life in a world drowning in fear. And when it ended, Joe didn't head back to his quarters. He stayed. He sat with the men, drank from their canteens, listened to their stories. To them, he wasn't a celebrity anymore. He was a brother. That night, one of the medics told him about a field hospital not far away, filled with men who hadn't walked in weeks. Joe didn't hesitate. At dawn, he was there. He went bed to bed, shaking hands, cracking small jokes. "You still got more fight than I do," he'd say. Some smiled through morphine dreams. Others cried quietly. One soldier with bandaged eyes said, "I heard your voice once on the radio, Joe. Now I can't see, but I know it's you." Joe held his hand and whispered, "You're still fighting, son. That's all that counts." Moments like that never made the newsreels, but they were the real battles Joe Louis fought. Between shows, he wrote letters to families, not his own, but those of men who had died. He told them their sons had fought bravely, that they weren't alone. He wasn't ordered to do it, he just did. For him, it was part of the same fight, the one for dignity, humanity, and decency in a world that had lost all three. By early 1944, he had traveled more than 20,000 miles across the war zones. He'd seen death, fire, and exhaustion, yet he kept going. Every camp expected him now. The soldiers waited, counted the days. When the rumor spread that he was coming, men shaved, cleaned their boots, wrote home just to say, "The champ's visiting." And when he finally arrived, the whole mood changed. Laughter replaced silence. Some said his presence did more for morale than any speech by any general. But the truth was, Joe was tired. His body was strong, but his spirit was heavy. Each handshake reminded him of someone who wouldn't make it home. Each smile hid a scar. He'd wake up at night, hearing the distant shellfire in his dreams, the echo of the wounded calling for help. Still, when morning came, he put on his uniform and went back out. He started carrying a small Bible in his pocket. Between stops, he'd take it out and read it quietly. Never for show, never for the press. He didn't preach religion, but he believed deeply in the idea that goodness had to survive, even in war. That's why his words, "We're on God's side," mattered so much. They weren't about arrogance. They were about belief in right over wrong. Not everyone shared that belief. Some officers resented him, the attention, the fame, the way his name overshadowed theirs. One commander reportedly said, "We didn't bring him here to start a movement." But Joe already had. His fights had broken down more color lines in the army than any official order. Wherever he went, he demanded mixed audiences. Soldiers black and white sat together because Joe Louis said they would, and no one dared argue with the man who could knock out propaganda itself. Back home, he'd become a legend. His photo in uniform covered magazine covers. Roosevelt mentioned him in speeches. But Joe never read the headlines. His world was smaller. Mud, noise, sweat, and the quiet moments when soldiers cried on his shoulder. One night, after a long show in Anzio, a private sat next to him and said, "You make us believe we'll see home again." Joe looked down at his gloves and murmured, "That's the fight that matters." As spring came, the war pushed north. Italy bled city by city. Joe followed the troops through broken towns and ruined cathedrals. He saw children begging for food, women searching for missing sons, priests burying soldiers in gardens. He'd grown up poor, but this was something else, the destruction of hope itself, and it changed him. He stopped seeing himself as a boxer or a symbol. He saw himself as a witness. Every time he stepped into a ring or spoke to a soldier, he carried those faces with him, the blind man, the nurse, the orphan. He realized war wasn't about nations. It was about people trying not to lose their souls. In one camp near Monte Cassino, a chaplain asked him to say something to the troops before a major offensive. Joe hesitated. He wasn't a preacher, but he walked up to the front and said, "I don't know what waits out there, but I know what we got here, each other. We keep standing, we keep fighting, and maybe that's what being on God's side really means." The men didn't cheer. They just nodded silently, understanding every word. That night, many of those same soldiers went into battle. Some didn't return. Joe heard the news the next day and sat alone for a long time. Then he picked up his gloves, wrapped his hands, and went back to the ring. He knew the show had to go on, not for fame, but for them. By the end of 1944, Joe Louis had visited more than 400,000 troops. He had fought hundreds of exhibition matches and raised millions for the war effort. But the real impact couldn't be measured in numbers. It lived in the hearts of men who had seen hell and still found the strength to smile. When those soldiers thought of home, they didn't just picture family. They pictured a man in uniform, calm, humble, telling them they still had a reason to believe. Joe Louis wasn't fighting enemies anymore. He was fighting despair itself, and somehow he was still winning. May 1945, Paris. The war was ending. The guns fell silent, and the sky that had carried so much smoke now glowed with peace. Soldiers filled the streets, waving flags, singing, crying. Joe Louis stood among them, the champion, the soldier, the man whose words had carried across continents. "We're gonna win because we're on God's side." He had spent 3 years on the road in deserts, jungles, and ruins. He'd fought more than 100 exhibition matches, visited hundreds of hospitals, lifted the spirits of 500,000 men. Now, the fighting was done. But for Joe Louis, peace would be harder to survive than war. When he returned to America, the crowds were waiting. New York gave him a parade. Flashbulbs exploded, flags waved. Reporters shouted questions. "How does it feel to be home, champ?" Joe smiled, waved, and said what everyone wanted to hear. "Feels good to be back." But behind that calm smile, something in him had changed. The same country he'd fought for was still divided. Restaurants refused to serve black soldiers in uniform. Hotels turned them away. On trains, veterans who had risked their lives sat in the colored section. Joe saw it all. He had carried the American flag across the world, but now that flag seemed to have no place for him. He tried to go back to boxing. The army needed its hero again, this time in the ring. He fought exhibitions for victory bonds, raising money for veterans, schools, hospitals. But he didn't keep a cent. Every paycheck went back to the government. He thought he was doing the right thing. What he didn't know was that the Internal Revenue Service was keeping score. In 1946, Joe received a letter. The IRS claimed he owed over $100,000 in taxes on the very money he had donated during the war. He thought it was a mistake. It wasn't. His generosity, his patriotism, his blind faith in the system, all of it had become a weapon turned against him. He appealed to the government, explained that every dollar had gone to military causes, but bureaucracy doesn't have a heart. They told him rules were rules. The man who had been the face of American unity was now another name in the debt files. He could have spoken out, could have shouted betrayal, but Joe Louis was a soldier. Silence was his armor. When reporters asked about it, he shrugged and said quietly, "I just wanted to do my part." That silence became heavier each day. He had fought for a country that didn't fight for him back. The weight of it showed in his eyes. He was still boxing, still smiling for cameras, but his punches weren't the same. The crowd didn't cheer as loudly. New champions were rising. To the public, he was fading. To his fellow soldiers, he was still a god. He spent much of 1946 traveling again, not for war this time, but for the veterans. He visited military hospitals, charity events, orphanages. He shook hands with men missing limbs, told jokes to kids who had lost their fathers. He tried to fill the silence with kindness, but every handshake reminded him of the system that had forgotten him. At night, when the lights went out and the applause was gone, Joe sat alone, counting debts, thinking of faces from the war. The men who never came home, the nurses who smiled through tears, the young soldier who had once said, "You make us believe we'll see home again." America was celebrating peace, but Joe Louis couldn't find his own. In 1947, the government called again. The war was over, but they wanted another kind of battle, a propaganda one. They asked him to speak at events about American values. Joe agreed, but he changed the message. In his speeches, he didn't talk about victory, he talked about fairness. "We fought side by side," he said to the crowd, "and if we can do that in war, we can do it in peace." The crowd cheered, but many politicians frowned. Joe wasn't supposed to be political, but he wasn't being political, he was being honest. He began to notice something about the veterans who came to see him. They weren't asking for autographs, they were asking for help. Black veterans denied housing loans, denied jobs, ignored by the same country they had died for. Joe tried to use his fame to open doors for them. Some opened, most didn't. Most. His closest friends said that by then, Joe Louis was carrying two wars, the one the world remembered and the one America didn't want to face. He fought one more major match that year, not for money, but because the IRS demanded payment. The crowd still rose when he entered the ring, but he wasn't the same fighter. Every punch seemed to echo with something deeper: frustration, fatigue, loss. When he won, he didn't raise his fists, he just lowered his head. After the fight, a reporter asked him, "Champ, what keeps you going after all these years?" Joe thought for a long time before answering, "Because quitting would make everything mean nothing." The next morning, the same newspapers that once called him America's hero printed a smaller headline: "Louis in debt, IRS pursues boxer." The public moved on. The war was over, the heroes were fading. But in the barracks, the bars, and the hospitals, the soldiers never forgot him. His photos still hung in the mess halls, his quote carved into the walls: "We're gonna win because we're on God's side." It had become more than a sentence. It was a promise that outlasted victory, defeat, and even justice. In private, Joe Louis once said to a friend, "You can win every fight in the world and still lose the one inside." That was the battle he was fighting now, the quiet one, the invisible one, the one without applause. And yet, even in betrayal, Joe Louis refused bitterness. He still wore his uniform at veterans' parades. He still smiled for the kids, still shook the hands of soldiers. When one asked him if he regretted serving, he said, "Never. I'd do it again, maybe better next time." By the end of 1947, America had moved on to new heroes, but the soldiers who had fought in the mud still remembered the man who walked among them, not as a star, not as a saint, but as one of them. To them, Joe Louis would always be more than a boxer. He was proof that even in betrayal, dignity could survive. He had fought for God's side, and somehow, even after everything, he still believed he was on it. New York, 1948. The lights of Madison Square Garden burned brighter than ever, but for Joe Louis they no longer meant glory, they meant survival. The IRS was chasing him, his body was aging, his mind carried ghosts from the war. Every punch now had a different sound, not of triumph, but of debt of duty, of a man trying to buy back his peace. He stepped into the ring one more time, not as the brown bomber, but as a man fighting to stay afloat. When the bell rang, the crowd roared, thousands screaming his name, the same way they had before the war. But Joe knew those cheers weren't the same. They were nostalgic. They were for the man he used to be. He fought with heart, but his hands no longer had the same fire. Still, he won. And when the referee lifted his arm, Joe didn't smile. He whispered to himself, "One more round." That's how he lived from then on, one more round at a time. He kept boxing through pain, fatigue, humiliation. Every dollar went to the government. He fought exhibitions, charity matches, even staged fights, anything to cover the debt that should never have been his. The public saw a champion. He saw an obligation. When asked why he didn't quit, he said simply, "You don't stop fighting just because it's hard." As the 1950s began, Joe's life became quieter, lonelier. The spotlight faded. New heroes appeared. The young didn't remember the war, the sacrifices, the speeches. But the soldiers, the ones who had seen him in the mud, who had heard his voice when they needed hope, they never forgot. They wrote him letters, thanking him for saving their spirits. Many called him the only champion who never lost where it mattered. But America's memory was short. Joe Louis struggled with bills, with health, with purpose. The country had changed. He had not. He still believed in decency, in unity, in the faith that had guided him through the war. When he walked down the street, people still called him champ, but most didn't know what that word had cost him. In 1951, his body finally gave out. He was knocked out by Rocky Marciano, a young fighter who had idolized him as a child. After the fight, Marciano hugged him and cried, saying, "Joe, you're still my hero." Joe smiled and said, "You did good, kid." It was the end of an era. The fighter who had symbolized America's faith had fallen, but not in defeat, in passing the torch. He retired that night. The debts, however, remained. The fame was gone, the crowds silent. For a while, Joe Louis disappeared from the headlines. He worked odd jobs, appeared in small promotions, even as a greeter in Las Vegas casinos, the world champion opening doors for tourists. Some laughed at him, others pitied him, but the soldiers who walked past him didn't see a greeter. They saw the man who once made them believe they would live. Many saluted him quietly, without a word. In his later years, Joe found peace, not in glory, but in gratitude. He spent time with veterans, visiting hospitals again, as he had during the war. He brought gifts, told stories, prayed with them. He never mentioned his debts, his pain, or the government's betrayal. He talked only about faith, the same faith that carried him across the battlefields. "You don't win with hate," he used to say. "You win with heart." The 1960s came, and with them a new America. Civil rights marches, new leaders, new voices. Joe Louis didn't march, but he supported the cause quietly, with donations, encouragement, and his presence. Younger black athletes like Muhammad Ali looked up to him, even when they rebelled against his quietness. "Without Joe Louis," Ali said, "there wouldn't be no me." As the years passed, Joe's health began to fail. The toll of war, boxing, and stress caught up with him. He walked with a cane, his hands trembling, but his spirit was still solid, humble, soft-spoken, unbroken. He once told a journalist, "I've had good days and bad ones, but I never stopped believing in people." Then came 1981. Joe Louis was 66. He spent his last days in Las Vegas, still visiting soldiers, still shaking hands, still signing autographs for strangers who didn't know the full story. On April 12th, 1981, the man who had once been America's strongest voice for faith and unity quietly passed away. The news spread slowly, then like wildfire. For a moment, America remembered. The newspapers called him a patriot, a hero, a symbol of honor. President Ronald Reagan ordered full military honors. And when his coffin was carried into Arlington National Cemetery, draped in the flag he had once fought for, there was silence. The same silence that follows a final bell. Soldiers, young and old, stood at attention. Some saluted, others cried. One veteran whispered, "He fought for us all." The man who had said, "We're on God's side," was finally going home. As the bugle played, a soldier placed a pair of old, worn boxing gloves on the coffin. On the tag inside, written in faded ink, were 4 words, "Property of Joe Louis." In that moment, the world remembered not the fighter, but the man, the soldier who never surrendered to bitterness, the hero who gave everything he had, even when the world gave nothing back. Joe Louis's story wasn't just about war or boxing. It was about what it means to keep faith when everything else breaks. He had seen humanity at its worst, in racism, in bureaucracy, in war. And yet, He chose to believe in its best. Decades later, historians would call him a sports icon, a symbol of unity, a pioneer. But to the soldiers who fought in the mud and prayed in the dark, he was something simpler, the voice that reminded them that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep fighting in spite of it. And maybe that's what he meant all along. Because when Joe Louis said, "We're going to win because we're on God's side," he wasn't talking about nations or armies. He was talking about faith, faith in something higher, not divine victory, but moral survival. And in that sense, he was right. Because long after the wars ended, long after the cheers faded, Joe Louis still won. Not in the ring, not in history books, but in the hearts of those who believed because he did.